In a previous video, I mentioned that our understanding of dyslexia depends on the aims and the purposes of the people who define dyslexia. Well, let's take that a little bit deeper. The people who define dyslexia, typically the people with the voice who define dyslexia, tend to be, for instance, the International Dyslexia Association, the British Dyslexia Association, and the Dyslexia Institute. There's a couple of others, but mainly it's these three organisations. You might find that the World Health Authority has something, World Health Organization's got something to say as well. European Dyslexia Association. You'll notice these definitions are very, very Anglo-centric in their understanding of dyslexia. And the Anglo-centric nature of these definitions means that the perspectives and the aims and the purposes that the people who define it are coming from are Anglo-centric aims and purposes. Now, if you go to certain developing nations, and I mean developing in terms of their understanding of dyslexia, if you go to certain nations in Africa, like Nigeria, you'll find that they're trying to understand dyslexia, but they're taking on board the International Dyslexia Association and the British Dyslexia Association's view of dyslexia. And these are Anglo-centric views of dyslexia. Being Anglo-centric, they have the Anglo-centric perspective of dyslexia. The Anglo-centric perspective of dyslexia includes an economic perspective, a political perspective, an educational perspective, and a linguistic perspective, and an interpersonal perspective. Different cultures have different perspectives on what it means to have interpersonal relationships, and they have different perspectives on politics and education and literature and literacy. And so when an African nation adopts the International Dyslexia Association or the British Dyslexia Association's view of what dyslexia is, they are adopting, effectively, a white view of what dyslexia is. Now, there's nothing wrong with being white, but on the other hand, if you come from a background that is radically different, whose culture takes a different interpersonal perspective, a different economic, educational perspective, a different perspective of what it is to blend perfectly and seamlessly into a society, and you take a perspective from the European Dyslexia Association, which has a Eurocentric view of what it means to blend into society, then you're effectively taking somebody else's view and having that view imposed on your own culture. Especially where, let's stick with Nigeria, but other countries in Africa, you have three languages. You have, for instance, Swahili, you have a local language, and then you have the language of instruction, which is English. Now, this language of instruction, this English language of instruction, of course, is often orthographically more opaque than the local languages. And so not only is the perspective of dyslexia very Anglo-centric, but of course you're having to deal with it in an English language, in an orthographically opaque language. You're steering very, very close to cultural appropriation indeed. The very notion that you can have an African understanding of dyslexia using a European or an English or a British or an American understanding of what it is coming from that cultural perspective is actually nonsensical. You can't do it. And so what we need to bring together everybody. We need to start to find an interculturally acceptable view of dyslexia. And an interculturally acceptable view of dyslexia means that we need to bring in African voices, we need to bring in Asian voices, we need to bring in Far Eastern voices, South Asian voices, we need to bring in all of these different voices, South American voices. Because if we don't do that, then all of our eggs are going to go into an Anglo-centric basket. All of our research is going to go into a culturally specific form of dyslexia awareness. And actually, that might not be appropriate if you live in Nigeria or Kenya.